One over. Chapter 1. Professor Farrago had remarked to me that morning, "The city of New York always reminded me of a slovenly fat woman with her dress unbuttoned behind." I nodded. "New York's architecture," said I, "or what popularly passes for it, is all front. The minute you get to the rear, a pitiable condition is exposed." He said, "Professor Jane Bottomley is all facade. The remainder of her is merely an occipital backyard full of theoretical tin cans and broken bottles. I think we all had better resign." It was a fearsome description. I trembled as I lighted an inexpensive cigar. The sentimental feminist movement in America was clearly at the bottom of the Bottomley affair. Long ago, in a reactionary burst of hysteria, the North enfranchised the Ethiopian. In a similar sentimental explosion of dementia, some 60 years later, the United States wept violently over the immemorial wrongs perpetuated upon the restless sex, opened the front and back doors of opportunity, and sobbed out, "Go to it, ladies." They are still going. Professor Jane Bottomley was wished on us out of a pleasant April sky. She fell like a meteoric mass of molten metal upon the Bronx Park Zoological Society, splashing her excoriating personality over everybody until everybody writhed. I had not yet seen the lady. I did not care to. Sooner or later I'd be obliged to meet her, but I was not impatient. Now, the Field Expeditionary Force of the Bronx Park Zoological Society is, perhaps, the most important arm of the service. Professor Bottomley had just been appointed official head of all field work. Why? Nobody knew. It is true that she had written several combination nature and love romances. In these popular volumes, trees, flowers, butterflies, birds, animals, dialect, sobs, and sunbonnets were stirred up together into a saccharine mess, eagerly gulped down by a provincial reading public, which immediately protruded its tongue for more. The news of her impending arrival among us was an awful blow to everybody at the Bronx. Professor Farrago fainted in the arms of his pretty stenographer. Professor Cornelius Lezard of the Batrachian department ran around his desk all day long in narrowing circles and was discovered on a stomach still feebly squirming like an expiring top. Dr. Hans Fuss, our beloved professor of pachydermatology, sat for hours weeping into his noodle soup. As for me, I was both furious and frightened, for, within the hearing of several people, Professor Bottomley had remarked in a very clear voice to her new assistant, Dr. Daisy Delmore, that she intended to get rid of me for the good of the Bronx, because of my reputation for indiscreet gallantry among the feminine employees of the Bronx Society. Professor Lezard overheard that outrageous remark, and he hastened to repeat it to me. I was lunching at the time in my private office in the administration building with Dr. Hans Fuss. He and I, being too busy dissecting an unusually fine specimen of dingo to go to the Rolling Stone Inn for luncheon, when Professor Lezard rushed in with the scandalous libel still sizzling in his ears. "Everybody heard her say it," he went on, wringing his hands. "It was a most unfortunate thing for anybody to say about you before all those young ladies. Every stenographer and typewriter there turned pale and then red." "What?" I exclaimed, conscious that my own ears were growing large and hot. "Did that outrageous woman have the bad taste to say such a thing before all those sensitive girls?" "She did. She glared at them when she said it. Several blondes and one brunette began to cry." "I hope," said I, a trifle tremulously, "that no typewriter so far forgot herself as to admit noticing playfulness on my part." "They were all tearfully unanimous in declaring you to be a perfect gentleman." "I am," I said. "I am also a married man, irrevocably wedded to science. I desire no other spouse. I am ineligible, and everybody knows it." If at times a purely scientific curiosity leads me into a detached and impersonally psychological investigation of certain, feminine idiosyncrasies. Certainly, said Lezard, to investigate the feminine is more than a science. It is a duty. Of a surety, nodded Dr. Fuss. I looked proudly upon my two loyal friends, and bit into my cheese sandwich. Only men know men. A jury of my peers had exonerated me. What did I care for Professor Bottomley? All the same, added Lezard, you'd better be careful, or Professor Bottomley will put one over on you. I am always careful, I said with dignity. All men should be. It is the only protection of a defenseless coastline, nodded Lezard. And never commit nothing to paper, added Dr. Fuss. Don't never write it. I love you like I was going to blow up already. Ach, nein, don't you write down somethings. Every man he is entitled to protection, and so is it he is protected. Stein in hand, he beamed upon us benevolently over his knifeful of saucerfish. Then he fed himself and rammed it down with a hearty draught of Pilsner. We gazed with reverence upon Kultor as embodied in this great Teuton. That woman, remarked Lezard to me, certainly means to get rid of you. It seems to me that there are only two possible ways for you to hold down your job at the Bronx. You know it, don't you? I nodded. Yes, I said. Either I must pay marked masculine attention to Professor Bottomley, or I must manage to put one over on her. Of course, said Lezard, the first method is the easier for you. Not for a minute, I said hastily. I simply couldn't become frolicsome with her. You say she's got a voice like a drill sergeant, and she goose-steps when she walks. I don't mind admitting she has me badly scared already. No, she must be scientifically ruined. It is the only method which makes her elimination certain. But if her popular nature books didn't ruin her scientifically, how can we hope to lead her astray? Inquired Lezard. There is, I said thoughtfully, only one thing that can really ruin a scientist. Ridicule. I have braved it many a time, taking my scientific life in my hands in pursuit of unknown specimens, which might have proved only imaginary. Public ridicule would have ended my scientific career in such an event. I know of no better way to end Professor Bottomley's scientific career and capability for mischief than to start her out after something which doesn't exist, inform the newspapers, and let her suffer the agonizing consequences. Dr. Fuss began to shout. The idea is schon, kolossal, prachtvoll, ausgezeichnet, wunderbar, wunderschön, gemütlich. A large, tough noodle checked him. While he labored with Teutonic imperturbability to master it, Lezard and I exchanged suggestions regarding the proposed annihilation of this fearsome woman who had come ravening among us amid the peaceful and soporific environment of Bronx Park. It was a dreadful thing for us to have our balmy lotus-eater's paradise so startlingly invaded by a large, loquacious, loud-voiced lady who had already stirred us all out of our agreeable, traditional, and leisurely inertia. Inertia begets cogitation, and cogitation begets ideas, and ideas beget reflection, and profound reflection is the fundamental cornerstone of that immortal temple in which the goddess Science sits asleep between her dozing sisters, custom and religion. This thought seemed to me so unusually beautiful that I wrote it with a pencil upon my cuff. While I was writing it, quietly happy in the deep pleasure that my intellectual allegory afforded me, Dr. Fuss swabbed the last morsel of nourishment from his plate with a wad of rye bread. Then, bolting the bread and wiping his beard with his fingers and his fingers on his waistcoat, he made several guttural observations too profoundly German to be immediately intelligible, and lighted his porcelain pipe. Ach was, he remarked in ruminative fashion. Dat Frauenzimmer, she is to raise hell already determined. Von pachydermatology she knows nothing. Maybe she leaves me alone. Maybe it is to be raus mit me. Ich weiß nie. It is aber besser one over on that lady to put, yes? "It is certainly advisable," replied Lizard. "Let us try to think of something sufficiently disastrous to terminate her scientific career," said I, and I bowed my rather striking head and rested the point of my forefinger upon my forehead. Thought crystallizes more quickly for me when I assume this attitude. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lizard fold his arms and sit frowning at infinity. Dr. Fuss lay back in a big, deeply padded armchair and closed his prominent eyes. His pipe went out presently, and now and then he made long-drawn nasal remarks in German, too complicated for either Lizard or for me to entirely comprehend. "We must try to get her as far away from here as possible," mused Lizard. "Is Oyster Bay too far and too cruel?" I pondered darkly upon the suggestion, but it seemed unpleasantly like murder. "Lizard," said I, "come, let us reason together. Now what is woman's besetting emotion?" "Curiosity." "Very well. Assuming that to be true, what quality particularly characterizes women when so beset?" "Ruthless determination." "Then," said I, "we ought to begin by exciting the curiosity of Professor Bottomley, and her ruthless determination to satisfy that curiosity should logically follow." "How," he asked, "are we to arouse her curiosity?" "By pretending that we have knowledge of something hitherto undiscovered, the discovery of which would redound to our scientific glory." "I see. She'd want the glory for herself. She'd swipe it." "She would," said I. He giggled. "Wouldn't it be funny to plant something phony on her?" I waved my arms rather gracefully in my excitement. "That is the germ of an idea," I said. "If we could plant something far away from here, very far away. If we could bury something, like the Cardiff Giant." "Hundreds and hundreds of miles away." "Thousands," I insisted enthusiastically. "In Tasmania, for example. Maybe a Tasmanian devil might acquire her." "There exists a gnat," said I, "in Borneo, Natus soporificus, and when this tiny gnat stings people, they never entirely wake up. It's really rather a pleasurable catastrophe, I understand. Life becomes one endless catnap, one delightful siesta, with intervals for light nourishment. She could sit very comfortably in some pleasant retreat and rock in a rocking chair and doze quite happily through the years to come. And from your description of her, I should say that the Soldiers' Home might receive her." "It won't do," he said gloomily. "Why? Is it too much like crime?" "Oh, not at all. Only, if she went to Borneo, she'd be sure to take a mosquito bar with her." In the depressed silence which ensued, Dr. Fuss suddenly made several futurist observations through his nose with monotonous but authoritative regularity. I tried to catch his meaning and his eye. The one remained cryptic, the other shut. Lizard sat thinking very hard, and as I fidgeted in my chair, fiddling nervously with various objects lying on my desk, I chanced to pick up a letter from the pile of still unopened mail at my elbow. Still pondering on Professor Bottomley's proposed destruction, I turned the letter over idly, and my preoccupied gaze rested on the postmark. After a moment, I leaned forward and examined it more attentively. The letter directed to me was postmarked Fort Carcajou, Cook's Peninsula, Baffinland, and now I recalled the handwriting, having already seen it 3 or 4 times within the last month or so. "Lizard," I said, "that lunatic trapper from Baffinland has written to me again. What do you suppose is the matter with him? Is he just plain crazy, or does he think he can be funny with me?" Lizard gazed at me absently. Then, all at once, a gleam of savage interest lighted his somewhat solemn features. "Read the letter to me," he said, with an evil smile, which instantly animated my own latent imagination, and immediately it occurred to me that perhaps in the humble letter from the wilds of Baffinland, which I was now opening with eager and unsteady fingers, might lie concealed the professional undoing of Professor Jane Bottomley, and the only hope of my own ultimate and scientific salvation. The room became hideously still as I unfolded the pencil-scrawled sheets of cheap ruled letter paper. Dr. Fuss opened his eyes, looked at me, made porcine sounds, indicative of personal well-being, relighted his pipe, and disposed himself to listen. But just as I was about to begin, Lézard suddenly laid his forefinger across his lips, conjuring us to densest silence. For a moment or two, I heard nothing except the buzzing of flies. Then I stole a startled glance at my door. It was opening slowly, almost imperceptibly. But it did not open very far. Just a crack remained. Then, listening with all our might, we heard the cautiously suppressed breathing of somebody in the hallway just outside of my door. Lézard turned and cast at me a glance of horrified intelligence. In dumb pantomime, he outlined in the air, with one hand, the large and feminine amplification of his own person, conveying to us the certainty of his suspicions concerning the unseen eavesdropper. We nodded. We understood perfectly that she was out there, prepared to listen to every word we uttered. A flicker of ferocious joy disturbed Lézard's otherwise innocuous features. He winked horribly at Dr. Fuss and at me, and uttered a faint click with his teeth and tongue, like the snap of a closing trap. "Gentlemen," he said, in a guarded yet excited voice of a man who is confident of not being overheard, "the matter under discussion admits of only one interpretation. A discovery, perhaps the most vitally important discovery of all the centuries, is imminent. Secrecy is imperative. The scientific glory is to be shared by us alone, and there is enough of glory to go around. Mr. Chairman, I move that epoch-making letter be read aloud." "I second that motion," said Dr. Fuss, winking so violently at me that his glasses wabbled. "Gentlemen," said I, "it has been moved and seconded that this epoch-making letter be read aloud. All those in favor will kindly say aye." "Aye, aye," they exclaimed, fairly wriggling in their furtive joy. "The contrary-minded will kindly omit the usual negation," I went on. "It seems to be carried. It is carried. The chairman will proceed to the reading of the epoch-making letter." I quietly lighted a 5-cent cigar, unfolded the letter, and read aloud. "Jones's Shack, Golden Glacier, Cook's Peninsula, Baffinland, March 15th, 1915. Professor, dear sir, I already wrote you 3 times, no answer having been received. Perhaps you think I'm kiddin'. You're a damn liar. I ain't. Hoping to tempt you to come, I will hereby tell you more'n I told you in my other letters. The terminal moraine of this here Golden Glacier finishes into a marsh. Nothing to see for miles except frozen tussock and mud, and all flat as hell for 50 miles, which is where I'm trapping it for mink and otter, and now ready to go back to Fort Carcajou. I told you what I seen sticking in under this here marsh. Where anything sticks out, the wolves have eat it. But most of them there elephants is in under the ice and mud too far for the wolves to get 'em. I ain't kiddin' you. There is a whole herd of furry elephants in the marsh, like as they were stuck there and all laid down and was drowned like. Some has tusks and some hasn't. 2 elephants stuck out of the ice. I eat into one. The meat was good and sweet and juicy, and damn wolves eat it up that night. I had cut steaks and roast for 3 months, though, and am eating off it yet. Thinking as how elephants and all like that is your graft, I being a keeper in the mouse house once in the Bronx, and seeing you nosing around like you was all full of scientific thinks, it comes to me to write you and put you next. If you say so, I'll wait here and help you with them elephants. Livin' wages is all I ask, also $11,000 for tippin' you wise. I won't tell nobody till I hear from you. I'm honest, and you can trust me. Writes me to Fort Carcajou if you mean business. So no more. Respectfully, James Scaw. When I finished reading, I cautiously glanced at the door, and finding it still on the crack, turned and smiled subtly upon Lézard and Fuss. In their slowly spreading grins, I saw they agreed with me that somebody, signing himself James Scaw, was still trying to hoax the great Zoological Society of Bronx Park. "Gentlemen," I said aloud, injecting innocent enthusiasm into my voice. "This secret expedition to Baffinland, which we three are about to organize, is destined to be without doubt the most scientifically prolific field expedition ever organized by man. Imagine an entire herd of mammoths preserved in mud and ice through all these thousands of years. Gentlemen, no discovery ever made has even remotely approached in importance the discovery made by this simple, illiterate trapper, James Scaw." "I thought," protested Lézard, "that we are to be announced as the discoverers." "We are," said I, "the discoverers of James Scaw, which makes us, technically, the finders of the ice-preserved herd of mammoths. Technically, you understand. A few $1,000s, I added carelessly, ought to satiate James Scaw." "We could name that glacier after him," suggested Dr. Fuss. "Certainly, the Scaw Glacier. That ought to be enough glory for him. It ought to satisfy him and prevent any indiscreet remarks," nodded Lézard. "Gentlemen," said I, "there is only one detail that really troubles me. Ought we to notify our honored and respected Chief of Division concerning this discovery?" "Do you mean, should we tell that accomplished and fascinating lady, Professor Bottomley, about this herd of mammoths?" I asked in a loud, clear voice, and immediately answered my own question. "No," I said. "No, dear friends. Professor Bottomley already has too much responsibility weighing upon her distinguished mind. No, dear brothers in science, we should steal away unobserved, as though setting out upon an ordinary field expedition. And when we return with fresh and immortal laurels, such as no man before has ever worn, no doubt that our generous-minded Chief of Division will weave for us further wreaths to crown our brows, the priceless garlands of professional approval." And I made a horrible face at my co-conspirators. Before I finished, Lézard had taken his own face in his hands for the purpose of stifling raucous and untimely mirth. As for Dr. Fuss, his small, porcine eyes snapped and twinkled madly behind his spectacles, but he seemed rather inclined to approve my flowers of rhetoric. "Ja," said he, "so is it besser ourselves dat gefrosens herd von Elephanten to discover, und by and by die Elephanten by der Bronx Park home yet again once more to bring. We shall therefore much praise thereby bekommen. Ach was!" "Gentlemen," said I distinctly, "it is decided, then, that we shall say nothing concerning the true object of this expedition to Professor Bottomley." Lézard and Fuss nodded assent. Then, in the silence, we all strained our ears to listen, and presently we detected the scarcely heard sound of cautiously retreating footsteps down the corridor. When it was safe to do so, I arose and closed my door. "I think," said I, with a sort of infernal cheerfulness in my tones, "that we are about to do something jocose to Jane Bottomley." "A few," said Professor Lézard. He rose and silently executed a complicated ballet step. "I shall laugh," said Dr. Fuss earnestly, "and I shall laugh, and I shall laugh. Ach Gott, how I shall laugh my Polly head off." I folded my arms and turned Romanesquely toward the direction in which Professor Bottomley had retreated. "Viper," I said, "the Bronx shall nourish you in its bosom no more. Fade away, Ophidian." The sentiment was applauded by all. There chanced to be in my desk a bottle marked "That's All." On the label somebody had written, "Do it now." We did. Chapter 3. It was given out at the Bronx that our field expedition to Baffinland was to be undertaken solely for the purpose of bringing back living specimens of the five-spotted Arctic woodcock, Philohela quinquemaculata, in order to add to our onomatology and our glossary of onomatopoeia an ontogenesis of this important but hitherto unstudied subspecies. I trust I make myself clear. Scientific statements should be as clear as the Spoiten Deuvel, sola in stagno salus. But two things immediately occurred which worried us. Professor Bottomley sent us official notification that she approved our expedition to Baffinland, designated the steamer we were to take, and enclosed tickets. That scared us. Then, to add to our perplexity, Professor Bottomley disappeared, leaving Dr. Daisy Delmore in charge of her department during what she announced might be a somewhat prolonged absence on business. And during the 4 feverish weeks of our pretended preparations for Baffinland, not one word did we hear from Jane Bottomley, which caused us painful inquietude as the hour approached for our departure. Was this formidable woman actually intending to let us depart alone for the Golden Glacier? Was she too lazy to rob us of the secretly contemplated glory which we had pretended awaited us? We had been so absolutely convinced that she would forbid our expedition, pack us off elsewhere, and take charge herself of an exploring party to Baffinland, that, as the time for our leaving drew near, we became first uneasy, and then really alarmed. It would be a dreadful jest on us if she made us swallow our own concoction, if she revealed to our colleagues our pretended knowledge of the Golden Glacier and James Scaw and the supposedly ice-embedded herd of mammoths, and then publicly forced us to investigate this hoax. More horrible still would it be if she informed the newspapers and gave them a hint to make merry over 3 wise men of the Bronx who went to Baffinland in a boat. "What do you suppose that devious and secretive female is up to?" inquired Lezard, who, within the last few days, had grown thin with worry. "Is it possible that she is sufficiently degraded to suspect us of trying to put one over on her? Is that what she is now doing to us?" "Terminus est. It is the limit," said I. He turned a morbid eye upon me. "She is making a monkey of us, that's what." "Suspendenda omnia naso," I nodded. "Tarde sed tutte." When I think aloud in Latin, it means that I am deeply troubled. "Sumcumque celos agitat." Do you get me, Professor? I'm sorry I attempted to be sportive with this terrible woman. The curse of my scientific career has been periodical excesses of frivolity. See where this frolicsome impulse has landed me. Super abyssum ambulans, trahit suacumque voluptas, transiat in exemplum. She means to let us go to our destruction on this mammoth frappe affair. But Dr. Fuss was optimistic. "I think she is already herself by dot Baffinland gegangen," he said. "I think she has der bait geswallowed. We wait, we see, and so is it we know." "But why hasn't she stopped our preparations?" I demanded. "If she wants all the glory to herself, why does she permit us to incur this expense in getting ready?" "No mans ken to know der workings of der mental process by a Frauenzimmer," said Dr. Fuss, wagging his head. The suspense became nerve-wracking. We were obliged to pack our camping kits, and it began to look as though we were having either to sail the next morning or to resign from the Bronx Park Zoological Society, because all the evening papers had the story in big type, the details and objects of the expedition, the discovery of the herd of mammoths in cold storage, the prompt organization of an expedition to secure this unparalleled deposit of prehistoric mammalia. Everything was there, staring at us in violent print, excepting only the name of the discoverer and the names of those composing the field expedition. "She means to betray us after we have sailed," said Lezard, greatly depressed. "We might just as well resign now, before this hoax explodes and bespatters us. We can take our chances in vaudeville, or as lecturing professors with the movies." I thought so too. In point of fact, we had all gathered in my study to write out our resignations, when there came a knock at the door, and Dr. Daisy Delmore walked in. Oddly enough, I had not before met Dr. Delmore personally. Only formal written communications had hitherto passed between us. My idea of her had doubtless been inspired by the physical and intellectual aberrations of her chief. I naturally supposed her to be either impossible or corporeally redundant, or intellectually and otherwise as weazened as last year's lychee nut. I was criminally mistaken, and why Lezard, who knew her, had never set me right, I could not then understand. I comprehended later. For the feminine assistant of Professor Jane Bottomley, who sauntered into my study and announced herself, had the features of Athene, the smile of Aphrodite, and the figure of Psyche. I believe I do not exaggerate these scientific details, although it has been said of me that any pretty girl distorts my vision and my intellectual balance to the detriment of my calmer reason and my differentiating ability. "Gentlemen," said Dr. Delmore, while we stood in a respectful semicircle before her, modestly conscious of our worth, our toes turned out, and each man's features wreathed with that politely unnatural smirk which masculine features assume when confronted by feminine beauty. "Gentlemen, on the eve of your proposed departure for Baffinland in quest of living specimens of the five-spotted Philohela quinquemaculata, I have been instructed by Professor Bottomley to announce to you a great good fortune for her, for you, for the Bronx, for America, for the entire civilized world. It has come to Professor Bottomley's knowledge, recently I believe, that an entire herd of mammoths lies encased in the mud and ice of the vast flat marshes which lie south of the terminal moraine of the Golden Glacier in that part of Baffinland known as Dr. Cook's Peninsula. The credit of this epoch-making discovery is Professor Bottomley's entirely. How it happened she did not inform me. 1 month ago today she sailed in great haste for Baffinland. At this very hour she is doubtless standing all alone upon the frozen surface of that wondrous marsh, contemplating with reverence and awe and similar holy emotions the fruits of her own unsurpassed discovery." Dr. Delmore's lovely features became delicately suffused and transfigured as she spoke. Her exquisite voice thrilled with generous emotion. She clasped her snowy hands and gazed enraptured at the picture of Dr. Bottomley, which her mind was so charmingly invoking. "Perhaps," she whispered, "perhaps at this very instant, in the midst of that vast and flat and solemn desolation, the only protuberance visible for miles and miles is Professor Bottomley. Perhaps the pallid Arctic sun is setting behind the majestic figure of Professor Bottomley, radiating a blinding glory to the zenith, illuminating the crowning act of her career with its unearthly aura." She gazed at us out of dimmed and violet eyes. "Gentlemen," she said, "I am ordered to take command of this expedition of yours. I am ordered to sail with you tomorrow morning on the Labrador and Baffin line steamer Dr. Cook. The object of your expedition, therefore, is not to be the quest of Philohela quinquemaculata. Your duty is now to corroborate the almost miraculous discovery of Professor Bottomley, and to disinter for her the vast herd of frozen mammoths, pack and pickle them, and get them to the Bronx. Tomorrow's morning papers will have the entire story. The credit and responsibility for the discovery and the expedition belong to Professor Bottomley, and will be given to her by the press and the populace of our great republic. It is her wish that no other names be mentioned, which is right. To the discoverer belongs the glory. Therefore, the marsh is to be named Bottomley's Marsh, and the glacier Bottomley's Glacier. Yours and mine is to be the glory of laboring incognito under the direction of the towering scientific intellect of the age, Professor Bottomley. And the most precious legacy you can leave your children, if you get married and have any, is that you once wielded the humble pick and a shovel for Jane Bottomley on the bottomless marsh which bears her name." After a moment's silence, we 3 men ventured to look sideways at each other. We had certainly killed Professor Bottomley, scientifically speaking. The lady was practically dead. The morning papers would consummate the murder. We didn't know whether we wanted to laugh or not. She was now virtually done for, that seemed certain. So greedily had this egotistical female swallowed the silly bait we offered. So arrogantly had she planned to eliminate everybody excepting herself from the credit of the discovery, that there seemed now nothing left for us to do except to watch her hurtling deliriously toward destruction. Should we burst into hellish laughter? We looked hard at Dr. Delmore, and we decided not to. Yet. Said I, "To assist at the final apotheosis of Professor Bottomley makes us very, very happy. We are happy to remain incognito, mere ciphers blotted out by the fierce white light which is about to beat upon Professor Bottomley fore and aft. We are happy that our participation in this astonishing affair shall never be known to science. But happiest of all are we, dear Dr. Delmore, in the knowledge that you are to be with us, and of us, incognito on this voyage now imminent, that you are to be our revered and beloved leader. And I, for one, promise you personally the undivided devotion of a man whose entire and austere career has been dedicated to science, in all its branches. I stepped forward rather gracefully, and raised her little hand to my lips, to let her see that even the science of gallantry had not been neglected by me. Dr. Daisy Delmore blushed. Therefore, said I, considering the fact that our names are not to figure in this expedition, and furthermore, in consideration of the fact that you are going, we shall be very, very happy to accompany you, Dr. Delmore. I again saluted her hand, and again Dr. Delmore blushed and looked sideways at Professor Lézard. Chapter 4. It was, to be accurate, exactly 23 days later that our voyage by sea and land ended one Monday morning upon the gigantic terminal moraine of the Golden Glacier, Cook's Peninsula, Baffinland. 4 pack mules carried our luggage. 4 more bore our persons. An Arctic dickybird sat on a boulder and said, "Pilly willy willy, tweet tweet." As we rode out to the boulder-strewn edge of the moraine, the rising sun greeted us cordially, illuminating below us the flat surface of the marsh, which stretched away to the east and south as far as the eye could see. So flat was it that we immediately made out the silhouettes of 2 mules tethered below us a quarter of a mile away. Something about the attitude of these mules arrested our attention, and, gazing upon them through our field glasses, we beheld Professor Bottomley. That resourceful lady had mounted a pneumatic hammock upon the 2 mules. Their saddles had sockets to fit the legs of the galvanized iron tripod. No matter in which way the mules turned, sliding swivels on the hollow steel frames regulated the hammock slung between them. It was an infernal invention. There lay Jane Bottomley asleep, her black hair drying over the hammock's edge, gilded to a peroxide luster by the rays of the rising sun. I gazed upon her with a sort of ferocious pity. Her professional days were numbered. I, also, had her number. "How majestically she slumbers," whispered Dr. Delmore to me, dreaming doubtless of her approaching triumph. Dr. Fuss and Professor Lézard, driving the pack mules ahead of them, were already riding out across the marsh. "Daisy," I said, leaning from my saddle and taking one of her gloved hands into mine, "the time has come for me to disillusion you. There are no mammoths in that mud down there." She looked at me in blue-eyed amazement. "You are mistaken," she said. "Professor Bottomley is celebrated for the absolute and painstaking accuracy of her deductions, and the boldness and the imagination of her scientific investigations. She is the most cautious scientist in America. She would never announce such a discovery to the newspapers unless she were perfectly certain of its truth." I was sorry for this young girl. I pressed her hand because I was sorry for her. After a few moments of deepest thought, I felt so sorry for her that I kissed her. "You mustn't," said Dr. Delmore, blushing. "The things we mustn't do are so many that I can't always remember all of them." "Daisy," I said, "we shall pledge ourselves to each other for eternity, here in the presence of this immemorial glacier, which moves 1,000 inches a year. I mean, an inch every 1,000 years. Here in these awful solitudes, where incalculable calculations could not enlighten us concerning the number of cubic tons of mud in that marsh. Here in the presence of these innocent mules." "Oh, look!" exclaimed Dr. Delmore, lifting her flushed cheek from my shoulder. "There is a man in the hammock with Professor Bottomley." I leveled my field glasses incredulously. Good heavens, there was a man there. He was sitting on the edge of the hammock in a dejected attitude, his booted legs dangling. and as I gazed, I saw the arm of Professor Bottomley raised, as though groping instinctively for something in her slumber, saw her fingers close upon the blue flannel shirt of her companion, saw his timid, futile attempts to elude her, saw him inexorably hauled back and his head forcibly pillowed upon her ample chest. "Daisy," I faltered, "what does yonder scene of presumable domesticity mean?" I haven't the faintest idea," she stammered. "Is that lady married, or is this revelry?" I asked sternly. "She wasn't married when we sailed from New York," faltered Dr. Delmore. We rowed forward in pained silence, spurring on until we caught up with Lézard and Fuss and the pack mules. Then we all pressed ahead, a prey now to the deepest moral anxiety and agitation. The splashing of our mules' feet on the partly melted surface of the mud aroused the man as we rode up, and he scrambled madly to get out of the hammock as soon as he saw us. A detaining feminine hand reached mechanically for his collar, groped aimlessly for a moment, and fell across the hammock's edge. Evidently, its owner was too sleepy for effort. Meanwhile, the man who had floundered free from the hammock leaped overboard and came hopping stiffly over the slush towards us like a badly winged snipe. "Who are you?" I demanded, drawing a bridle so suddenly that I found myself astride of the mule's ears. Sliding back into the saddle, I repeated the challenge haughtily, inwardly cursing my horsemanship. He stood balancing his lank 6'6" of bony altitude for a few moments without replying. His large, gentle eyes of baby blue were fixed on me. "Speak," I said. "The reputation of a lady is at stake. Who are you? We ask, before we shoot you, for purpose of future identification." He gazed at me wildly. "I don't know who I be," he replied. "My name was James Scaw, before that there lady went and changed it on me. She says she's changed my name to hers. I don't know. All I know is I'm married." "Married?" echoed Dr. Delmore. He looked dully at the girl, then fixed his large, mild eyes on me. "A mission priest done it for her a month ago when we was hiking towards Fort Carcajou. Who in hell are you?" he added. I informed him with dignity. He blinked at me, at the others, at the mules. Then he said, with infinite bitterness, "You're a fine guy, ain't you, a wishing this here lady onto a poor pelt hunter what ain't never done nothing to you." "Who did you say I wished on you?" I demanded, bewildered. "That there lady is sleeping into the nuptial hammock. You wished her onto me. Yes, you did. What in hell have I done to you, eh?" We were dumb. He shoved his hand into his pocket, produced a slug of twist, slowly gnawed off a portion, and buried the remains in his vast jaw. "All I done to you," he said, "was to write you them letters saying as how I found a lot of elephants into the mud. What you done to me was to send that there lady here. Was that gratitude? Man to man, I ask you." A loud snore from the hammock startled us all. James Scaw twisted his neck turkey-like and looked warily at the hammock. Then turning to me, "Aw," he said, "she don't never wake up till I have breakfast ready." "James Scaw," I said, "tell me what has happened. On my word of honor, I don't know." He regarded me with lackluster eyes. "I was a-setting on a boulder," said he, "a-figuring out whether you was a-comin' or not, when that there lady rides up with her lead mule a-trailin'. Says she, 'Are you James Scaw?' 'Yes, marm,' says I, kinder scared and puzzled. 'Where's them elephants?' says she, reaching down from her saddle and taking me by the shirt collar and beating me with her umbrella. Says I have wrote to a certain gent that I would show him them elephants for a price. Being strictly honest, I can't show 'em to no one else until I hear from him." With that, she continued to argue the case with her umbrella, never letting go of my shirt collar. Sir, she argued until dinner time, and then she resumed the debate until I fell asleep, and last I knowed she was still conversing. And so it went next day, all day long, and the next day, and I couldn't stand it no longer, so I started for Fort Carcajou, but she being onto a mule, run me down easy, and kept beside me, conversing voluble. Sir, do you know what it is to listen to an umbrella argument every day, all day long, from sun-up to nightfall, and then some more? I was loony, I tell you, when we met the mission priest. 'Marry me,' says she, 'or I'll talk you to death.' I didn't realize what she was saying and what I answered, but them words I uttered done the job, it seems. We camped there and slept for 2 days without waking. When I waked up, I was convalescent. She was good to me. She made soup, and she wrapped blankets on me, and she didn't talk no more until I was well enough to endure it. And by, she broke the news to me that we was married, and that she had went as far as to marry me in the sacred cause of science, because man and wife is one, and what I knowed about them elephants she now had a right to know. Sir, she had put one over on me. So, being strictly honest, I had to show her where them elephants lay frozen up under the marsh. Chapter 5. Where the ambition of this infatuated woman had led her appalled us all. The personal sacrifice she had made in the name of science awed us. Still, when I remembered that detaining arm sleepily lifted from the nuptial hammock, I was not so certain concerning her continued martyrdom. I cast an involuntary glance of critical appraisal upon James Skaw. He had the golden hair and beard of the early Christian martyr. His features were classically regular. He stood 6'6". He was lean because fit, sound as a hound's tooth, and really a superb specimen of masculine health. Curry him and trim him and clothe him in evening dress, and his physical appearance would make a sensation at the court of St. James. Only his English required manicuring. The longer I looked at him, the better I comprehended that detaining hand from the hammock. Fabas indulgit fames. Then, with a shock, it rushed over me that there evidently had been some ground for this man's letters to me concerning a herd of frozen mammoths. Professor Bottomley had not only married him to obtain the information, but here she was still camping on the marsh. "James Skaw," I said tremulously, "where are those mammoths?" He looked at me, then made a vague gesture. "Under the mud, everywhere, all around us." "Has she seen them?" "Yes, I showed her about 100. There's one under you. Look, you can see him through the slush." "Oh, Gott!" burst from Dr. Fuss, and he tottered in his saddle. Lézard, frightfully pale, passed a shaking hand over his brow. As for me, my hair became dank with misery, for there, directly under my feet, the vast hairy bulk of a mammoth lay dimly visible through the muddy ice. What I had done to myself, when I was planning to do to Professor Bottomley, suddenly burst upon me in all its hideous proportions. Fame, the plaudits of the world, the highest scientific honors, all these in my effort to annihilate her, I had deliberately thrust upon this woman to my own everlasting detriment and disgrace. A sort of howl escaped from Dr. Fuss, who had dismounted and who had been scratching in the slush with his feet like a hen, for already the slight gallinaceous effort of his laid bare a hairy section of frozen mammoth. Lézard, weeping bitterly, squatted beside him, clawing at the thin skin of ice with a pickaxe. It seemed more than I could bear, and I flung myself from my mule, and seizing a spade, fell violently to work, the tears of rage and mortification coursing down my cheeks. "Hurrah!" cried Dr. Delmore, excitedly, scrambling down from her mule, and lifting a box of dynamite from her saddlebags. Transfigured with enthusiasm, she seized a crowbar, traced in the slush the huge outlines of the buried beast, then, measuring with practised eye the irregular zone of cleavage, she marked out a vast oval, dug holes along it with her bar, dropped into each hole a stick of dynamite, got out the batteries and wires, attached the fuses, covered each charge, and retired on a run toward the moraine, unreeling wire as she sped upward among the boulders. Half frantic with grief and half mad with the excitement of the moment, we still had sense enough to shoulder our tools and drive our mules back across the moraine. Only the mule hammock in which reposed Professor Bottomley remained on the marsh. For one horrid instant, temptation assailed me to press the button before James Skaw could lead the hammock mules up to the moraine. It was my closest approach to crime. With a shudder, I viewed the approach of the mules. James Skaw led them by the head. The hammock on its bar and swivels swung gently between them. Professor Bottomley slept, lulled, no doubt, to deeper slumber by the gentle swaying hammock. When the hammock came up, one by one, we gazed upon its unconscious occupant. And, even amid dark and revengeful thoughts, amid a mental chaos of grief and fury and frantic self-reproach, I had to admit to myself that Jane Bottomley was a fine figure of a woman, and good-looking too, and that her hair was all her own, and almost magnificent at that. With a modiste to advise her, a maid to dress her, I myself might have... but let that pass. Only as I gazed upon her fresh complexion and the soft parted red lips of Professor Bottomley, and as I noted the beautiful white throat and prettily shaped hands, a newer, bitterer, and more overwhelming despair seized me, and I realized now that perhaps I had thrown away more than fame, honors, applause. I had perhaps thrown away love. At that moment, Professor Bottomley awoke. For a moment, her lilac-tinted eyes had a dazed expression. Then they widened, and she lay very quietly looking from one to another of us, cradled in the golden glory of her hair, perfectly mistress of herself, and her mind as clear as a bell. "Well," she said, "so you have arrived at last." And to Dr. Delmore she smilingly extended a cool, fresh hand. "Have you met my husband?" she inquired. We admitted that we had. "James!" she called. At the sound of her voice, James Scaw hopped nimbly to do her bidding. A tender smile came into her face as she gazed upon her husband. She made no explanation concerning him, no apology for him, and, watching her, it slowly filtered into my mind that she liked him. With one hand in her husband's and one on Dr. Delmore's arm, she listened to Daisy's account of what we were about to do to the embedded mammoth, and nodded approval. James Scaw turned the mules so that she might watch the explosion. She twisted up her hair, then sat up in her hammock. Daisy Delmore pressed the electric button. There came a deep jarring sound, a vast upheaval, and out of the mud rose 5 or 6 dozen mammoths, and toppled gently over upon the surface of the ice. Miserable as we were at such an astonishing spectacle, we raised a tragic cheer as Professor Bottomley sprang out of her hammock, and, telling Dr. Delmore to get a camera, seized her husband and sped down to where one of the great hairy frozen beasts lay on the ice in full sunshine. And then we tasted the last drop of gall which our over-slopping cup of bitterness held for us. Professor Bottomley climbed up the sides of the frozen mammoth, dragging her husband with her, and stood there waving a little American flag while Dr. Delmore used up every film in the camera to record the scientific triumph of the ages. Almost idiotic with the shock of my great grief, I reeled and tottered away among the boulders. Foos came to find me, and when he found me, he kicked me violently for some time. "So Dummkopf," he said. When he was tired, Lizard came and fell upon me, showering me with kicks and anathema. And when he went away, I beat my head with my fists for a while. Every little helped. After a time, I smelled cooking, and presently Dr. Delmore came to where I sat huddled up miserably in the sun behind the boulder. "Luncheon is ready," she said. I groaned. "Don't you feel well?" I said that I did not. She lingered, apparently with the idea of cheering me up. "It's been such fun," she said. "Professor Lizard and I have already located over 150 mammoths within a short distance of here, and apparently there are hundreds, if not thousands, more in the vicinity. The ivory alone is worth over $1 million. Isn't it wonderful?" She laughed excitedly and danced away to join the others. Then, out of the black depth of my misery, a feeble gleam illuminated the Stygian obscurity. There was one way left to stay my approaching downfall. Only one. Professor Bottomley meant to get rid of me, for the good of the Bronx, but there remained a way to ward off impending disaster. And though I had lost the opportunity of my life by disbelieving the simple honesty of James Scaw, and though the honors and emoluments and applause which ought to have been mine were destined for this determined woman, still, if I kept my head, I should be able to hold my job at the Bronx. Dr. Delmore was immovable in the good graces of Professor Bottomley, and the only way for me to retain my position was to marry her. The thought comforted me. After a while I felt well enough to arise and partake of some luncheon. They were all seated around the campfire when I approached. I was welcomed politely. Inquiries concerning my health were offered, but the coldly malevolent glare of Dr. Fuss and the calm contempt in Lezard's gaze chilled me, and I squatted down by Daisy Delmore and accepted a dish of soup from her in mortified silence. Professor Bottomley and James Scaw were feasting connubially side by side, and she was selecting tidbits for him, which he dutifully swallowed, his large, mild eyes gazing at vacancy in a gentle, surprised sort of way as he gulped down what she offered him. Neither of them paid any attention to anybody else. Fuss gobbled his lunch in a sort of raging silence. Lezard, on the other side of Dr. Delmore, conversed with her continually in undertones. After a while, his persistent murmuring began to make me uneasy, even suspicious, and I glared at him sideways. Daisy Delmore, catching my eye, blushed, hesitated, then, leaning over toward me with delightful confusion, she whispered, "I know that he will be glad to hear that I have just promised to marry your closest friend, Professor Lezard." "What?" I shouted with all my might. "Have you put one over on me, too?" Lezard and Fuss seized me, for I had risen and was jumping up and down and splashing them with soup. "Everybody has put one over on me," I shrieked. "Everybody! Now I'm going to put one over on myself!" And I lifted my plate of soup and reversed it on my head. They told me later that I screamed for half an hour before I swooned. Afterward, my intellect being impaired, instead of being dismissed from the department, I was promoted to the position which I now hold as President Emeritus of the Consolidated Art Museums and Zoological Gardens of the City of New York. I have easy hours, little to do, and 20 ornamental stenographers and typewriters engaged upon my memoirs, which I dictate when I feel like it, steeped in the aroma of the most inexpensive cigar I can buy at the Rolling Stone Inn. There is one typist in particular, but let that pass. Vir sapit qui pauca loquitur.